December 15, 1943. The transport truck rumbled through the frozen Ohio countryside, carrying 37 Italian prisoners of war toward an uncertain future. Among them sat Marco Rossini, a 42-year-old aeronautical engineer from Turin, his hands still bearing the permanent stains of machine oil and blueprint ink. He clutched a leather satchel containing his most precious possessions, a slide rule, a worn notebook filled with aircraft specifications, and a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters standing before the Mole Antonelliana. The other men in the truck were engineers too, specialists who had worked for Fiat, Macchi, and Reggiane designing the fighters and bombers that had carried Italy's hopes into the Mediterranean skies. Now they sat in silence, their faces masks of exhausted dignity, watching the alien landscape roll past through the truck's canvas opening. Everything here seemed impossibly vast compared to the cramped workshops and factories they had known in Italy. Captain William Harrison stood outside the camp's main gate, reviewing the manifest one final time. His superiors in Washington had sent specific instructions about this particular group of prisoners. Unlike the thousands of Italian soldiers captured in North Africa, who now picked cotton in Texas or harvested crops in California, these men possessed technical knowledge that might prove useful. The Army Air Forces had established a specialized facility at this camp where damaged aircraft were brought for study and salvage. Someone in the Pentagon had decided that putting enemy engineers to work on American planes was either brilliantly pragmatic or dangerously naive. Harrison suspected it was both. The truck stopped, and the prisoners climbed down stiffly, their breath creating small clouds in the December cold. Marco noticed immediately that this camp looked different from the one where they had spent their first 2 weeks after arriving in America. Instead of the typical rows of barracks and guard towers, he saw several large hangars and what appeared to be a machine shop. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and hot metal carried on the wind, and despite everything, despite being a prisoner thousands of miles from home, Marco felt his heart quicken with something that might have been anticipation. Captain Harrison watched as the Italians formed a ragged line. They looked beaten down by their journey, by Italy's surrender, by the weight of being on the losing side of history. But Harrison noticed something else in their eyes too, especially in the older man with the leather satchel who stood straighter than the others. There was a spark there, a professional pride that captivity had not yet extinguished. "Welcome to Camp Perry," Harrison said, his words translated by a young corporal who spoke passable Italian. "You will be working in our aircraft maintenance and study facility. You will follow all orders, observe all regulations, and conduct yourselves with the same discipline you showed in your own service." Marco listened, understanding more English than he let on, and wondered what exactly they would be studying. As the guards led them toward their assigned barracks, he caught his first glimpse through an open hangar door of an American fighter aircraft, its distinctive shark-mouth nose art grinning at him across the tarmac. The morning of December 16th began with a wake-up call at 6 o'clock, followed by a breakfast of powdered eggs, toast, and coffee that Marco found surprisingly decent compared to the rations they had survived on during Italy's final months in the war. The 37 engineers ate together in a separate section of the mess hall, speaking in low voices, speculating about what their work would entail. Giovanni Ferretti, a propulsion specialist from Milan who had designed cooling systems for the Macchi 202 fighter, expressed what many were thinking. "They will have us sweeping floors and painting fences. Americans do not trust us with real work." Marco said nothing, but he remembered that glimpse of the fighter in the hangar and felt less certain. At 8 o'clock sharp, Captain Harrison appeared with a clipboard and 2 armed guards. He divided the engineers into 3 groups based on their specializations: airframe and structures, propulsion and engines, and instruments and systems. Marco found himself assigned to the propulsion group along with Giovanni and 11 others. They were marched across the compound to a massive hangar that looked new, its corrugated metal walls still shining in the weak winter sunlight. The guards opened the large sliding doors, and what Marco saw inside made him stop breathing for a moment. 5 aircraft occupied the hangar floor, each in various states of disassembly. Marco recognized them immediately from intelligence briefings and grainy reconnaissance photographs. P-40 Warhawks, the fighters that American volunteers had flown with the Flying Tigers in China, the same aircraft that had harassed Italian positions in North Africa. But seeing them in person was different from studying blurry photos. These machines possessed a brutal, functional beauty that Italian designs often sacrificed in favor of elegance. The nearest P-40 had its engine cowling removed, exposing the massive Allison V1710 engine. Tools lay organized on nearby benches, and technical manuals were stacked on a metal desk. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped forward from where she had been examining a propeller blade. She was 28 years old, a mechanical engineer from San Francisco whose parents had immigrated from China, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth in a world that often questioned it. "Gentlemen," she said, and the translator began converting her words to Italian. "You will be assisting with the documentation and analysis of these aircraft. We need detailed assessments of design features, manufacturing techniques, and performance capabilities. You will work under direct supervision at all times. You will not sabotage anything, because sabotaging American military equipment will result in severe consequences. But if you work honestly and professionally, you will be treated with respect." Marco studied her face as she spoke, noting the way she held eye contact, the absence of contempt in her expression. This was not someone who saw them as defeated enemies, but as fellow engineers who happened to be on the wrong side of a war. Giovanni whispered beside him, "She is very young to be giving us orders." Marco replied quietly, "She is young to be an engineer at all. The Americans must be desperate for technical personnel." He did not yet understand how wrong he was. The Italian engineers approached the P-40 with the cautious superiority of men who believed they understood aviation design. Marco circled the aircraft slowly, his practiced eye cataloging details. The fuselage seemed heavy and utilitarian, lacking the graceful lines of the Mach-E 202 or the elegant proportions of the Reggiane 2005. Giovanni ran his hand along the wing surface and frowned. "Look at this riveting," he muttered in Italian, loud enough for the others to hear. "So crude. They make no attempt to hide the fasteners or smooth the surface. This creates drag, reduces speed." Another engineer, Paolo Marconi from the Fiat, works in Turin, nodded in agreement. "The whole design philosophy is primitive. Function without art. This is why Italian aircraft are superior in maneuverability." Lieutenant Chen watched them from her position near the workbench, understanding none of their words, but reading their body language perfectly. She had seen this reaction before from German engineers who had been captured earlier in the war. That initial dismissiveness, the assumption that American engineering was somehow inferior because it did not conform to European aesthetic standards. She knew that assumption would not survive contact with reality, but she also knew that people learned better when they discovered truth themselves rather than being told. "Please begin with basic measurements," she instructed through the translator. "Document the engine displacement, cylinder configuration, and cooling system design. Compare it to equivalent Italian engines in your experience." Marco knelt beside the exposed Allison engine, his notebook ready. The engine was a 12-cylinder V configuration, liquid-cooled, nothing revolutionary about the basic architecture. He began measuring bore and stroke, calculating displacement. The numbers surprised him slightly. 1,500 cubic inches, or roughly 25 liters. Larger than most Italian engines, but size alone did not determine quality. What mattered was power-to-weight ratio, reliability, and manufacturing precision. He peered closer at the cylinder walls, expecting to see the rough machining marks that came from rushed wartime production. Instead, he found surfaces finished to a tolerance that seemed impossible for mass-produced components. Giovanni was examining the supercharger assembly, and Marco heard his colleague's sharp intake of breath. "Marco, come look at this." Marco moved to where Giovanni was pointing at the supercharger gears. The tooth cutting was extraordinarily precise, the metallurgy appeared flawless, and the bearing surfaces showed mirror-like finishing. This was the kind of work that required either extensive hand-fitting by master craftsmen or machine tools of exceptional accuracy. Giovanni's voice carried a note of uncertainty now. "This is very good work. Better than I expected from Americans." Paolo joined them, studying the engine mount structure. "The welds are perfect. Look here, and here. No slag, no porosity, consistent penetration. This is master-level welding throughout." Lieutenant Chen noticed the change in their postures, the way their breasts too. Dismissive gestures had transformed into genuine examination. She said nothing, simply made notes on her own clipboard. The afternoon light filtered through the hangar's high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where 3 Italian engineers were beginning to question assumptions they had held for years. The P-40 sat silent and patient, keeping secrets that would take weeks to fully reveal. The following week brought deeper investigation, and with it, deeper unease. Marco had requested permission to fully disassemble one of the Allison engines, and after some deliberation, Captain Harrison had approved the request under strict supervision. Now, on the morning of December 23rd, Marco and his team stood around a workbench covered with engine components laid out in precise order. Each piece told a story that contradicted everything Marco thought he knew about American industrial capacity. He picked up a piston, feeling its weight in his hands. The aluminum alloy was lighter than comparable Italian components, yet the surface hardness suggested heat treatment processes that should have made mass production prohibitively expensive. Marco examined the piston rings under a magnifying glass, looking for the telltale signs of hand-fitting that such precision would require. The rings showed no evidence of individual adjustment. They were manufactured to tolerances so exact that hand-fitting was unnecessary. He set the piston down and picked up a connecting rod, studying the bearing surfaces. Again, the same story. Precision that suggested artisanal care, but at a scale that implied factory production. Giovanni was working on the crankshaft, running measurements with his micrometer. His hands shook slightly as he recorded the numbers. "Marco, the balance is perfect. The counterweights are exactly matched. The bearing journals vary by less than 1/1000th of an inch across all 12 positions." He looked up, his face pale. "This kind of precision requires either weeks of manual balancing or machinery we do not have in Italy." Marco nodded slowly, feeling a cold weight settling in his stomach. He had spent 15 years in Italian aircraft factories. He knew what their best machinists could achieve, knew the limitations of their machine tools, understood the compromises they made between ideal specifications and practical production realities. Lieutenant Chen approached with a manila folder. "I have brought the production records for these engines," she said through the translator. "Captain Harrison approved my request to share basic statistics with you." She handed Marco a single sheet of paper covered in typed numbers. Marco scanned the page, certain he was misreading the English. Monthly production, 4,000 units. Annual capacity, 48,000 engines. He looked up at Lieutenant Chen, then back at the paper. "This number," he said, in halting English, pointing at the production figure. "This is for one factory?" Lieutenant Chen shook her head. "That is for 1 month, from multiple factories. Last year, 1942, total Allison engine production exceeded 60,000 units." The hangar seemed to tilt slightly. Marco sat down on a nearby stool, the paper still in his hand. 60,000 engines in 1 year. Italy's entire aviation industry, including all manufacturers, had produced perhaps 3,000 aircraft engines in 1942, and those had required constant rework and adjustment. Giovanni had stopped his measurements and was staring at Marco. "What did she say?" Marco repeated the numbers in Italian. Giovanni's face went white. Paolo, who had been examining cylinder heads, put down his tools and walked over. "That cannot be correct. No one can produce engines at that rate while maintaining this quality." That evening, Marco could not sleep. He lay in his bunk while the other prisoners snored around him in the darkness, his mind racing through calculations and implications. If the Americans were producing 60,000 aircraft engines per year with the precision he had witnessed, then the numbers for complete aircraft must be staggering. He had seen intelligence reports before Italy's surrender claiming American production was 10 times Italian capacity, but he had dismissed those figures as propaganda or exaggeration. Now, holding the evidence in his own oil-stained hands, he understood with sickening clarity that those reports had probably been conservative estimates. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Lieutenant Chen arrived with more documentation. She seemed to sense that the Italian engineers had reached a turning point, that their professional pride was giving way to genuine curiosity. "I have arranged for you to review production statistics for the P-40 aircraft," she announced. "Captain Harrison believes you should understand the full scope of American aviation manufacturing." She distributed folders to Marco, Giovanni, and Paolo, each containing graphs, charts, and typed summaries. Marco opened his folder with hands that trembled slightly. The first page showed P-40 production by year. 1939, 0. 1940, 377. 1941, 2,543. 1942, 4,219. 1943, 3,212, with production deliberately scaled back as newer models entered service. Marco did the mathematics in his head. Over 13,000 P-40s built in less than 4 years. He flipped to the next page and found comparative data for other American fighters. P-38s, P-47s, P-51s. The numbers were incomprehensible. Tens of thousands of aircraft, each one apparently built to the same exacting standards he had observed in the disassembled engine. Giovanni was reading his folder with an expression of disbelief. "It says here that Curtiss Wright employed 40,000 workers at their Buffalo plant alone. 40,000. That is more people than work in all of Turin's aircraft factories combined." Paolo had found a page showing the average time to build a P-40, approximately 48 hours from start to finish, including engine installation, systems integration, and flight testing. He read the figure aloud 3 times, as if repetition might make it seem less impossible. In Italy, building a fighter from components to flight-ready status required at least 3 weeks, often longer when accounting for parts shortages and quality issues. Lieutenant Chen let them absorb the information in silence. She had learned from her previous work with German engineers that this moment required careful handling. Men who had dedicated their lives to their profession were confronting the reality that their efforts had been futile from the start. Not because they lacked skill or dedication, but because they had been working within a system that could never compete with American industrial scale. "These numbers represent 1943 production," she said quietly. 1944 production is projected to be significantly higher across all aircraft types. Marco closed his folder and looked at her directly. "We never had a chance, did we?" he asked, in careful English. Lieutenant Chen met his gaze. "No," she said simply. "You never did." The revelation sparked heated arguments among the Italian engineers that lasted well into Christmas Day. The camp's recreation hall, decorated with modest paper ornaments by well-meaning guards, became an arena where professional identities clashed against undeniable evidence. Marco sat at one of the long tables, his production folders spread before him, while Giovanni paced back and forth, his voice rising with each circuit of the room. "You are too quick to accept their propaganda," Giovanni insisted. "These numbers are designed to demoralize us. Yes, the Americans have resources, but quantity does not equal quality. Our designs are still superior in aerodynamics, in elegance, in the relationship between pilot and machine." Paolo slammed his hand on the table. "Elegance? We are talking about elegance, while their factories produce aircraft faster than we can shoot them down? Wake up, Giovanni. I have examined that engine. I have measured those tolerances. This is not propaganda. This is manufacturing capability that makes our best efforts look like medieval blacksmithing." Other engineers joined the debate, voices overlapping in rapid Italian. Some sided with Giovanni, clinging to the belief that Italian engineering excellence somehow compensated for American industrial might. Others, like Paolo, had crossed a threshold of acceptance and were angry at themselves for not seeing the truth sooner. A few remained silent, processing their conclusions privately. Marco finally spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have spent 20 years designing aircraft engines. I know what is possible with the machine tools we had in Turin. I know what our metallurgists could achieve with the materials available to us. I know the limits of our electrical systems, our instrument manufacturing, our propeller production." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We did excellent work within our constraints, but the Americans do not have those constraints. They have raw materials we could only dream of, machine tools we did not know existed, and a manufacturing philosophy completely different from ours." Giovanni stopped pacing. "So you admit defeat? You accept that everything we worked for was pointless?" Marco shook his head. "I admit reality. There is a difference. We lost this war the moment it began, because we were fighting with 19th century industrial capacity against a nation that had already entered a new age of manufacturing. Our pilots were brave. Our designs were often clever. But we were building hundreds of aircraft per year while they built thousands per month. Mathematics does not lie, Giovanni. Physics does not care about pride." The room fell quiet. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the Ohio landscape in white. Through the window, Marco could see American soldiers heading toward their own Christmas celebrations, probably eager to return to families and homes that had never known bombardment or invasion. Lieutenant Chen appeared in the doorway, hesitating when she saw the tense faces of the Italian engineers. "I apologize for the interruption," she said through the translator. "I wanted to wish you Buon Natale and to tell you that Captain Harrison has approved additional research access for those interested in learning more about American manufacturing methods." She looked directly at Marco. "Some truths are painful, but understanding them is the first step toward something better." The day after Christmas, Lieutenant Chen stood before a blackboard in the hangar's small classroom, chalk in hand, facing 12 Italian engineers who had volunteered to attend her lecture on American manufacturing philosophy. Marco sat in the front row, his notebook open, ready to learn. Giovanni had not come, still processing his wounded pride in the barracks. But others, including Paolo, had decided that understanding their defeat was more valuable than nursing their egos. "The difference," Lieutenant Chen began, "is not that American engineers are smarter or more skilled than Italian engineers. The difference is philosophy." She wrote 2 words on the blackboard: interchangeable parts. In 1913, Henry Ford perfected the moving assembly line for automobile production. This concept revolutionized American manufacturing. Instead of skilled craftsmen building entire products from start to finish, we break production into simple, repeatable steps. Each worker becomes expert at one specific task. Each component is manufactured to such precise tolerances that any part fits any assembly, without custom fitting. Marco raised his hand. "But this removes the craftsman's art. In Italy, a master mechanic takes pride in hand-fitting components, in achieving perfection through skill and experience." Lieutenant Chen nodded. "Yes, and that Italian mechanic can probably build a better engine than any single American worker. But here is the question. How many engines can that master mechanic build in 1 month? 5? 10? She paused. "Our system produces 4,000 engines per month because we do not rely on individual mastery. We rely on systematic precision built into the manufacturing process itself." She turned back to the blackboard and wrote, "Standardization. American factories use standardized measurements, standardized tools, standardized procedures. A machinist in Buffalo uses the exact same specifications as a machinist in Los Angeles. If a part is manufactured in Detroit, it fits an assembly in Seattle. This allows us to distribute production across dozens of factories, train workers quickly, and maintain quality through systematic processes rather than individual skill." Paolo was taking notes furiously. "But how do you achieve such precision without master craftsmen? The machine tools themselves must be extraordinarily accurate." "Exactly," Lieutenant Chen said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "American investment in machine tool technology has been massive. We build machines that build machines. Our lathes, mills, and grinders are manufactured to tolerances that your Italian factories probably cannot measure, let alone achieve. Then we build thousands of these machine tools and distribute them to factories across the country." She drew a simple diagram showing the flow from raw materials to finished aircraft. The American system also benefits from vertical integration and specialized suppliers. We do not ask one factory to do everything. We have companies that only make instruments, companies that only make propellers, companies that only make hydraulic systems. Each becomes extraordinarily efficient at their specific task. Marco was beginning to understand something profound. Italian industry had tried to make each factory self-sufficient, capable of producing complete aircraft with minimal outside support. This seemed logical during wartime when supply lines might be disrupted. But it meant every factory remained small-scale, unable to specialize, unable to achieve the efficiencies that came with focusing on perfecting a single product or component. "You sacrifice elegance for efficiency," Marco said slowly. "You sacrifice the craftsman for the system." Lieutenant Chen smiled. "We sacrifice nothing. We simply recognize that elegance means nothing if you cannot produce enough aircraft to defend your country." January brought bitter cold to Ohio and a subtle shift in the relationship between the Italian engineers and their American counterparts. Marco found himself arriving at the hangar early each morning, eager to continue his education. The defensive pride that had characterized those first weeks had transformed into genuine curiosity. He began asking questions instead of offering criticisms, listening instead of lecturing. Lieutenant Chen noticed the change and responded by providing increasingly detailed access to technical documentation and manufacturing specifications. One morning, Marco stood beside her at a workbench covered with propeller components. "I do not understand how you achieve this blade pitch control mechanism," he admitted, gesturing at the complex hydraulic system that allowed P-40 pilots to adjust propeller pitch in flight. "Our Piaggio propellers used simpler mechanical systems, but they were less reliable and offered fewer pitch settings." Lieutenant Chen picked up a cross-section diagram. "The key is hydraulic pressure regulation. We use a constant speed governor that automatically adjusts blade angle to maintain optimal engine RPM regardless of flight conditions. The pilot sets desired RPM, and the system maintains it automatically." Marco studied the diagram, his engineering mind racing through the implications. "This requires precision machining of the hydraulic cylinders, perfect seals to prevent pressure loss, and metallurgy capable of withstanding constant stress cycling." He looked up at Lieutenant Chen. "In Italy, we assumed such systems were too complex for reliable field operation. We chose simplicity over capability." Lieutenant Chen met his gaze directly. "That is the fundamental difference in philosophy. You designed for what you could reliably produce and maintain with limited resources. We designed for optimal performance and then developed the manufacturing and maintenance infrastructure to support it." Across the hangar, Paolo was engaged in an intense technical discussion with Sergeant Robert Miller, a former Pratt & Whitney engineer now serving in the Army Air Forces. Paolo's English had improved dramatically over the past month, though his accent remained thick. "You say this supercharger produces 9 pounds of boost pressure at 20,000 feet altitude. How do you prevent detonation in the cylinders at such high compression ratios?" Sergeant Miller grinned, clearly enjoying the technical exchange. "Fuel quality. We developed 100-octane aviation gasoline specifically to handle high boost pressures. Higher octane rating means greater resistance to premature detonation." Paolo's eyes widened. 100 octane? Our best aviation fuel in Italy was 87 octane. Sometimes we received fuel as low as 78 octane, and our engines barely ran. The realization hit him visibly. "So even if we had copied your engine designs exactly, we could not have operated them properly because our fuel industry could not produce the necessary quality." Sergeant Miller nodded sympathetically. "Modern warfare requires complete industrial integration. The aircraft, the engine, the fuel, maintenance infrastructure, the pilot training, the supply chain, everything must work together as a system. Excellence in one area cannot compensate for weakness in another." Giovanni entered the hangar, looking uncertain. He had avoided the workshops for nearly 2 weeks, spending his time in the barracks reading and writing letters home. But isolation had become unbearable. He approached Marco hesitantly. "Is there room for one more student in your classroom?" he asked quietly. Marco smiled and gestured toward the workbench where Lieutenant Chen was explaining lubrication systems. There is always room for someone willing to learn. February 10, 1944. Captain Harrison gathered the Italian engineers in the camp's briefing room to announce an unprecedented opportunity. The War Department has approved a carefully supervised visit to the Curtiss Wright facility in Columbus, approximately 90 miles from this camp. You will observe aircraft production firsthand. You will be accompanied by armed guards at all times. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will follow instructions without question. Any violation of these rules will result in immediate return to standard prisoner status with no further privileges. Marco felt his pulse quicken. To see an actual American aircraft factory in operation was beyond anything he had imagined possible. The journey took 3 hours by military convoy, with the Italian engineers seated in covered trucks, surrounded by guards. Marco watched the Ohio countryside roll past through gaps in the canvas, seeing farmland that appeared prosperous and untouched by war. No bomb craters, no destroyed bridges, no burned-out buildings. America's industrial heartland had never known the devastation that had consumed Italy's factories and cities. When they arrived at the Curtiss Wright plant, Marco's first impression was of the sheer scale. The main factory building stretched for what looked like half a mile, with multiple auxiliary structures surrounding it like satellites around a planet. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Hundreds of workers moved with purposeful efficiency along assembly lines that seemed to stretch to infinity. Marco watched as P-40 fuselages progressed through sequential stations, each worker adding specific components with practiced precision. At one station, workers installed control cables. At the next, hydraulic lines. At the next, electrical systems. Each task took minutes, and the fuselage moved on to the next station on a wheeled dolly running along floor tracks. Lieutenant Chen, who had accompanied the group, pointed to a large board displaying production metrics. That board shows today's progress. We aim to complete 6 aircraft per day at this facility alone. Giovanni stood frozen, watching a wing assembly process where workers riveted aluminum skin to internal ribs using pneumatic tools that fired faster than hand riveting could ever achieve. The wings moved along an overhead conveyor system, stopping at each workstation for precisely timed intervals. A supervisor with a clipboard monitored progress, checking quality at predetermined inspection points. The process was mechanical, systematic, and remarkably fast. Paolo had found his way to the engine installation area where Allison V1710 engines were being mounted into P-40 airframes. He watched as 4 workers accomplished in 45 minutes what would have taken an Italian crew an entire day. They used specialized lifting equipment, pre-fitted mounting hardware, and worked from detailed instruction sheets that left nothing to chance. But what struck Marco most profoundly was not the machinery or the speed. It was the workers themselves. They were young, many of them women. They wore practical work clothes, safety glasses, and expressions of focused concentration. These were not master craftsmen with decades of apprenticeship. They were ordinary people, probably farmers and shopkeepers and housewives before the war, now building fighter aircraft with assembly line efficiency. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, was installing instrument panels with casual competence that would have required years of training in Italy. She caught Marco staring and offered a brief smile before returning to her work. That evening, Marco sat at the small desk in the corner of the barracks, a blank sheet of paper before him and a pen in his hand. The camp's censorship rules were clear. All letters home would be read by American officers. Anything relating to military capabilities would be redacted, and any attempt to include coded messages would result in loss of correspondence privileges. Still, Marco needed to write to his wife, Elena. He needed to try explaining what he had seen, what he had learned, even if he could not express the full magnitude of his revelation. "My dearest Elena," he wrote in Italian, knowing the censors employed translators. "I hope this letter finds you and our daughters safe and healthy. I think of you constantly and pray that the fighting has not reached Turin. Life here continues to be tolerable. We are well fed, warm, and treated fairly by our captors. I have been assigned to work that uses my engineering skills, examining American aircraft manufacturing. I cannot provide details, but I can say that I am learning much about different approaches to industrial production." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I have come to understand that our nation was not defeated through lack of courage or skill, but through differences in industrial capacity that we could not overcome, regardless of determination." Giovanni was writing his own letter at a nearby bunk, his pen moving slowly across the page. He had been humbled by the factory visit, and that humility showed in his words to his brother in Milan. "We believed many things that were not true. We believed Italian craftsmanship was superior. We believed our designs were more sophisticated. We believed quantity could not substitute for quality. All of these beliefs were comfortable lies that prevented us from seeing reality clearly." He stopped, crossing out the last sentence. Too direct, too likely to be censored. He tried again. "I am learning that there are many ways to solve engineering problems, and the American way is different from what we were taught." Paolo's letter to his elderly father was more philosophical. "Papa, you taught me that a man's worth comes from the quality of his work, from taking pride in perfection achieved through skill and patience. I still believe this. But I have also learned that in modern warfare, perfection achieved slowly means defeat achieved completely. The Americans have discovered how to build good enough products in overwhelming quantity. It is not the approach we would choose, but I must admit it is effective." He wondered if his father would understand, or if the old man would see this as abandonment of traditional values. Lieutenant Chen walked through the barracks during evening rounds, noticing the unusual number of prisoners bent over their writing. She did not interrupt, understanding that processing difficult truths often required expressing them to someone who mattered. Marco finished his letter with words that came from his heart. "When this war ends and I return home, I will have much to tell you about what I have seen. I have learned that our enemies are not monsters, but people much like ourselves who happen to be born in a nation with greater resources. I have learned that engineering is not just about elegance of design, but about matching solutions to available capabilities. Most importantly, I have learned humility." He signed his name and sealed the envelope. March brought warmer weather and a new project that Lieutenant Chen proposed to Captain Harrison. "Let them design," she suggested. "Give them paper, pencils, and drafting tools. Let them apply what pattern they have learned to theoretical improvements of Italian aircraft. It keeps them engaged, provides valuable insight into Italian design thinking, and offers them a way to process what they have experienced." Harrison approved the request, curious to see what enemy engineers might create when given freedom to imagine without resource constraints. Marco received his drafting supplies with hands that trembled slightly. It had been 6 months since he had been able to design anything. 6 months since he had felt the satisfaction of solving technical problems on paper. He spread a large sheet across the drafting table that had been set up in a quiet corner of the hangar and considered what to create. The Mach 202 fighter had been his last project in Italy, a beautiful aircraft that had been competitive in 1940 but was now hopelessly outclassed. What if he could redesign it, incorporating American manufacturing principles? He began sketching, his pen moving with increasing confidence. Instead of the complex, stressed skin construction that required skilled metalworkers, he designed a simpler airframe using standardized components that could be mass-produced. Instead of the hand-fitted engine cowlings that required hours of adjustment, he specified modular panels with standardized mounting points. Instead of the intricate fuel system with its multiple hand-formed lines, he drew a simplified system using standardized fittings and flexible hoses. Each design choice sacrificed some elegance for manufacturability, some aesthetic refinement for production speed. Giovanni worked at the adjacent table, redesigning the Reggiane 2005's cooling system. The original design had been a masterpiece of compact engineering, routing coolant through passages that minimized drag while maximizing heat dissipation. But it had also been incredibly difficult to manufacture and maintain. Giovanni's new design used simpler, larger passages that were less aerodynamically optimal, but could be produced quickly and serviced easily in field conditions. He caught himself smiling at the irony. A month ago, He would have considered such compromises to be professional heresy. Now he understood they were practical wisdom. Paolo was most ambitious, attempting to design an entirely new fighter that combined Italian aerodynamic knowledge with American manufacturing philosophy. His aircraft featured a laminar flow wing inspired by the P-51 Mustang he had glimpsed in photographs, but simplified for easier production. The fuselage was designed around modular sections that could be built separately and joined with standardized fittings. The engine installation was conventional rather than elegant, prioritizing accessibility for maintenance over minimizing frontal area. On paper, his design would be slightly slower than the best Italian fighters, but could be produced in months rather than years. Lieutenant Chen visited their drafting corner each afternoon, examining their progress with genuine interest. "You are learning," she said one day, studying Marco's redesigned Mach-E. "You are thinking like engineers who must deliver results rather than artists who must create perfection." Marco looked up from his work. "In Italy, we had the luxury of pursuing perfection because we built so few aircraft. We did not understand that luxury was actually poverty. Better to build 1,000 good aircraft than 100 perfect ones." He gestured at his drawing. "This will never be built, but designing it helps me understand what we should have done differently." April brought spring to Ohio, and an unexpected friendship between Lieutenant Chen and Marco. Their relationship had evolved from captor and prisoner to colleagues who shared a common language of engineering, even when that language had to pass through translators. One afternoon, Chen brought Marco a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the drafting table. "May I ask you a personal question?" she said. Marco nodded, setting down his pencil. "Why did you become an engineer?" It was a question no one had asked him in years. Marco thought for a moment before answering. "My father was a machinist in Turin. Not a designer, just a man who operated a lathe in a factory making textile equipment. But he loved machines, loved understanding how things worked. When I was 8 years old, he took me to see the Fiat works, and I watched them building automobiles. The precision, the purpose, the way individual components came together to create something greater than themselves, it was like music made from metal. I knew then that I wanted to spend my life creating machines." He paused. "And you? Why engineering for a woman in America? That cannot have been an easy choice." Chen smiled, a hint of old battles fought showing in her eyes. "My parents immigrated from China when I was 3 years old. My father worked in a laundry in San Francisco, my mother as a seamstress. They wanted better for their children, so they sacrificed everything for education. I was good at mathematics, excellent at physics. My high school teacher encouraged me to apply to university for engineering, though he warned me that I would face resistance as both a woman and a Chinese American. He was right. But the resistance taught me that proving yourself through excellence is more powerful than demanding acceptance." Giovanni had been listening from his nearby table. He approached hesitantly, his English improving but still halting. "Lieutenant Chen, I must apologize. When you first taught us, I thought you too young, too—" he struggled for words, "too different to understand real engineering. I was wrong. You understand not just machines, but the purpose of machines. In Italy, we forgot that aircraft exist to win wars, not to win design competitions." Chen accepted the apology with grace. "In every country, engineers must learn to balance idealism with pragmatism. You learned under conditions of scarcity, so you optimized for efficiency and small-scale production. We learned under conditions of abundance, so we optimized for mass production. Neither approach is inherently superior. They are responses to different circumstances." Sergeant Miller joined the conversation, bringing technical drawings of the new P-47 Thunderbolt. "Want to see what we are building now?" he asked the Italian engineers. "Makes the P-40 look like a training aircraft." The group gathered around the drawings, and for the next 2 hours, nationality and prisoner status dissolved into pure technical discussion. They debated supercharger configurations, analyzed propeller designs, and argued good-naturedly about the merits of liquid-cooled versus air-cooled engines. Marco realized with sudden clarity that this was what he had been missing for months. the intellectual companionship of fellow engineers who cared more about solving problems than about which flag they saluted. May 8, 1944, brought news that stopped Marco's heart. Captain Harrison called the Italian engineers to the briefing room, his face somber. Through the translator, he announced that Allied forces had broken through German defensive lines in Italy and were advancing toward Rome. Heavy fighting continued throughout the peninsula, with extensive damage to infrastructure and civilian areas. Marco sat frozen, thinking of Elena and his daughters in Turin. The city had already suffered bombing raids from American and British aircraft. Now ground combat might be approaching northern Italy as well. The Red Cross had established a system for limited communication between prisoners of war and their families, but it was agonizingly slow. Letters took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Marco had sent 6 letters to Elena since his capture. He had received one response, written in January, telling him that the family was surviving but that food was scarce and winter had been brutal. That single letter was now 4 months old. Anything could have happened since then. Giovanni received news that his brother's factory in Milan had been destroyed in a bombing raid. The letter from his sister-in-law was brief and written in shaky handwriting. His brother had survived but was injured. The family had lost their home and were living with relatives in the countryside. Paolo learned that his elderly father had died in February, probably from pneumonia compounded by malnutrition. The news came in a Red Cross telegram, just 3 sentences long, and Paolo held the paper with both hands as if it might dissolve. He had not been there. He had been in America, warm and well-fed, learning about manufacturing techniques while his father struggled through his final winter. The guilt was crushing. Lieutenant Chen found Paolo sitting alone in the hangar that evening, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking, understanding that some grief could not be comforted with words. After a long silence, Paolo spoke in Italian, then repeated himself in broken English. "I was angry at my father for not understanding modern engineering. I thought him old-fashioned, stuck in traditional ways. Now he is gone, and I cannot tell him that tradition has value too, that not everything must be sacrificed for efficiency." The accumulating news from Italy created a heavy atmosphere in the camp. The engineers continued their work, but their enthusiasm was dampened by worry and grief. Marco found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his designs, his mind constantly drifting to Elena and wondering if she was safe, if his daughters had enough to eat, if their home still stood. Lieutenant Chen adjusted the work schedule, allowing more time for the prisoners to write letters and to gather in small groups for mutual support. She had seen this before with other prisoners, the moment when the abstract concept of homeland became concrete reality of specific people in specific danger. One evening, Captain Harrison made an announcement. The Red Cross has confirmed that Turin suffered additional bombing last week. However, civilian casualties were reported as light, and residential areas were largely spared. Most damage was concentrated on industrial targets. Marco closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps Elena had received his letters. Perhaps she knew he was alive and thinking of her constantly. Perhaps they would both survive this war and find their way back to each other. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy signaled the beginning of the end for Germany and its remaining Axis partners. In the Ohio prisoner camp, the Italian engineers listened to radio broadcasts with mixed emotions. Liberation of Europe meant hope for their families, but it also meant the eventual reckoning with what came next. Marco stood at the window of the barracks, watching American soldiers celebrate the invasion news, and felt utterly disconnected from both his past and his future. Captain Harrison called a meeting in early July. The War Department is developing policies for Italian prisoners of war as the conflict moves toward conclusion, he announced. Italy is no longer our enemy. Your nation has joined the Allied cause against Germany. This changes your status and creates options that did not previously exist. He paused, letting the translator catch up. Some of you will be repatriated to Italy as soon as transportation can be arranged. Others may be eligible to remain in the United States under special provisions for technical specialists. The choice will be yours, but you must begin thinking about what you want your future to hold. That night, the barracks became a forum for anguished debate. Giovanni was adamant about returning. Italy is my home. My family is there. Whatever remains, whatever has been destroyed, it is still where I belong. I will help rebuild our country with what I have learned here. Others agreed, feeling the pull of homeland despite everything. But Marco found himself uncertain in ways that surprised him. He desperately wanted to see Elena and his daughters. But he had also begun to imagine possibilities that did not exist in devastated Italy. He had learned skills and approaches that would be wasted in a country with no functioning aircraft industry, no machine tool factories, no industrial infrastructure that could use his newfound knowledge. Paolo was wrestling with similar questions. My father is gone. My mother lives with my sister's family in Naples. I have no property, no position waiting for me. What do I return to? A country in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, probably facing years of poverty and rebuilding. He looked at Marco. Here, Lieutenant Chen says there may be opportunities in aviation companies for foreign engineers with appropriate clearances. We could continue learning, continue working in our profession. Is it wrong to consider staying? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications of loyalty, identity, and survival. Lieutenant Chen had been assigned to counsel the Italian engineers through this decision process. She met with Marco privately in her small office adjacent to the hangar. There is no wrong answer, she told him. Going home to family is honorable. Staying to build a new life is also honorable. Only you can determine which path serves your values and needs. Marco rubbed his face tiredly. In Italy, I would return as a defeated soldier, a man who worked for a fascist regime, someone who must live down shame. Here, I could simply be an engineer, judged by my skills rather than my history. But abandoning my country in its darkest hour, leaving my wife to face hardship alone for months or years more, while I pursue comfort in America, how could I live with that choice? Chen had no answer because there was no good answer, only difficult compromises and intentional, uncertain futures stretching in every direction. August 19, 1944. The day of decisions arrived with unexpected speed. Captain Harrison had received final authorization from the War Department regarding the disposition of Italian technical prisoners. Those who chose repatriation would be processed through Ellis Island and transported to Italy via Red Cross ships. Those who chose to remain would be transferred to a different status entirely, becoming civilian technical advisors under contract to American aviation companies, with paths toward eventual immigration if they desired. Marco had received a letter from Elena 3 days earlier, the first communication in 4 months. She wrote that the family was surviving, that the girls were healthy though thin, and that she prayed daily for his safe return. She also wrote something that surprised him: do what you must do for our future. If staying in America for a time means better opportunities later, I will understand. We have survived this long. We can survive longer if it means a better life when we are reunited. He read those sentences repeatedly, searching for hidden resentment or obligation, but found only Elena's practical wisdom. She had always been the stronger one. Giovanni stood in the camp's administrative office, signing repatriation papers with firm strokes of the pen. I am going home, he told Marco. Italy needs engineers who understand modern manufacturing. I can help rebuild our aviation industry, maybe help establish trade relationships with American companies. What I learned here has value precisely because I bring it back to where it is needed most. Marco embraced his friend, knowing they might never see each other again. You are a better man than I am, Giovanni. Giovanni shook his head. I am simply a man who knows where he belongs. You must discover where you belong. Paolo chose to remain, accepting a position with Curtiss Wright as a consulting engineer. His decision was eased by having no immediate family waiting in Italy, and by genuine excitement about continuing to learn American manufacturing methods. I will send money to my sister, he explained. I will help from here in ways I could not help from Naples. And perhaps in a few years, when Italy has stabilized, I will return with knowledge and resources that can make a real difference. 12 of the 37 Italian engineers ultimately chose repatriation. 25, including Marco, chose to stay. The day the first group departed was overcast and heavy with emotion. The departing engineers gathered their few possessions, said their goodbyes, and boarded the transport trucks that would take them to processing centers. Marco watched Giovanni's truck disappear down the road and felt a profound sense of loss mixed with relief. He had made his choice. He would work for Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, learning about radial engine design. He would send most of his earnings to Elena through Red Cross channels. And he would carry the weight of being comfortable while his family struggled, because there was no choice without sacrifice. Lieutenant Chen found him standing alone near the empty barracks. "Regrets?" she asked. Marco shook his head. "Not regrets. Just recognition that every choice has a cost. I have chosen the future over the past." 25 years after that August day when Italian engineers made their choices, Marco Rossini stood in the Hartford headquarters of Pratt & Whitney, now a senior design consultant with gray hair and reading glasses. The year was 1969, and the aerospace industry had transformed beyond anything he could have imagined during those early days at Camp Perry. He had helped design engines that powered jet aircraft, contributed to turbine technology that made modern aviation possible, and earned 17 patents bearing his name alongside American colleagues. Elena had joined him in America in 1946, bringing their daughters to a country that felt foreign but offered opportunities impossible in war-ravaged Italy. The reunion had been awkward at first, 2 years of separation creating distance that took months to overcome, but they had built a good life. Their daughters had attended American universities, married American men, and given Marco grandchildren who spoke English without accents and considered themselves fully American. Elena still sometimes spoke wistfully of Turin, of the mountains visible from their old apartment, of foods and friends left behind. But she had never blamed Marco for his choice. Giovanni had returned to Italy and become instrumental in rebuilding Fiat's aviation division, eventually rising to chief engineer. He and Marco had maintained correspondence over the decades, their letters filled with technical discussions and mutual respect. Giovanni had married, raised 3 children, and helped establish manufacturing partnerships between Italian and American aerospace companies. His path had been harder, rebuilding from rubble and scarcity, but he had made a profound difference in his homeland's recovery. Both men had chosen correctly for themselves, Marco believed, even though their choices had been different. Paolo had remained at Curtiss-Wright for 8 years before eventually returning to Italy in 1952 with an American wife and expertise that made him invaluable to Italy's growing aerospace sector. He had bridged both worlds, taking American knowledge back to Italian soil while maintaining connections that fostered international collaboration. Of the 25 engineers who had stayed, 18 eventually returned to Italy, taking with them skills and perspectives that accelerated European aviation development. The legacy of those Italian prisoners extended beyond individual careers. The relationships forged between enemy engineers had demonstrated that technical excellence transcended national boundaries, that professional respect could overcome political divisions. American companies had learned from Italian design, aesthetics, and aerodynamic sophistication. Italian companies had learned American manufacturing efficiency and systems integration. The post-war aerospace industry became increasingly international, with engineers from former enemy nations working together on projects that would have seemed impossible during the war years. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, now Dr. Chen and a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT, had written extensively about the Italian engineer program as a case study in cultural exchange and technical education. She maintained that the program's success came not from forcing American methods on reluctant prisoners, but from creating an environment where mutual learning could occur. Marco had been her primary source for a book she published about wartime technical cooperation, and they remained close friends. On this particular morning, Marco was preparing for a lecture at Yale University about the evolution of aircraft propulsion systems. His presentation would include stories from his time as a prisoner, from that moment of revelation when he first understood American industrial capacity. He would tell students that sometimes defeat teaches more valuable lessons than victory, that humility opens doors that pride keeps locked.